And thank all of you for being here and staying this enduring. I have the blessing and curse of being the last person. It's so interesting to be in this role because listening, my paper keeps morphing as we go from speaker to speaker. I can feel myself. Oh, I need to, and yeah, I should include that, or what am I going to do about that? But I also wanted to thank all the people online. We can't see them, but there's been 40-some people who've been listening to us very carefully, and they're from around the world. A couple of them have been in contact with me by email, so I just want to do a shout out to the group that's there. What I'm going to talk about tonight is really a kind of circulation of my own process. We're all talking about our own passions here. It's very clear, speaker after speaker. This is and what's amazing is that this book has that kind of evocative power that it can create this varied a set of responses in so many people. It's really kind of shocking. I can think of very few other pieces of literature where you get this level of kind of active engagement. My background, of course, is in science and quantum mechanics applied to chemistry and things like that. But that's only a very small part of the story for me in terms of engaging with this. Some of you have heard a little bit of this material, but I'm going to take a very different salient through it. So there will be a couple of the images that will look familiar, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to get to some of the new material. Now, the paper I have is 30-some pages. I'm not going to read it. So I'm going to try. I'll read little tiny sections of it because there's some new material in here. I'm getting more and more interested in the whole notion of oracular fields. And I would, the in paren comes from listening to Nancy Frulati's paper. Listening to Cassandra, I realized, yeah, that's part of what this is about. It's about trying to hear these voices that we have not allowed into our reflections. And I think Jung's, that's part of his trailblazing. But let me start fairly early on. This is from Liber Novus, of course, and this is Liber Primus, which you're looking at on your left-hand side, is very early on the blonde solar hero being pursued by a monstrous black beetle-like figure while the sun is being attacked by a number of snakes. And there are many ways to think about this, but I just want to give you a couple of reflections. First off, pay attention to the beetle, because this is going to be a key around synchronicity, right? The beetle story about Marcia Epper's, dream of the jeweled beetle, and Jung goes, boom, that kind of bit of magic that happened there. But at this point, it's in utter pursuit of this heroic figure. And what might that be? From giving the Fordham lectures and looking at what Jung was doing about 1910 to 1912, he was still writing in an idiom very much involved with the kind of logical, scientific perspective of the day. And it's very clear that by the time he was writing the second half of what became Symbols of Transformation later, there's a real change going on in his psychology. He really can no longer just hold to that, what I would call Enlightenment worldview. That's beginning to really crumble. And what we're seeing is the death of that kind of heroic scientific perspective. It's being amplified on the other side by a book that would have been very familiar to Jung. He had, Budge's the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And of course, this is the Night Sea Journey, what I'm showing here. And the very first gate of that is the god Khepri, who is the black beetle-shaped figure holding up the sun. This holding the sun up will be a very important part of our discussion. So you can see that beetle has something to do with a trip through the land of the dead. And that's what's pursuing Jung at this point. The relationship is a bit off from a kind of contemporary reflection. But look what happens by page 55. And all of you, if you'll just remember, when we go through the Red Book, the great thing is that we got a chronology. Even if we don't know the dates, we know that it was done sequentially. So we know how to locate ourselves in that sense. Same image, but now look what's happening. The solar figure now is in the boat. It's on the barge. The Leviathan is there, but they are moving in concert. They are moving together. This is no longer floundering and being overwhelmed by the unconscious. This is finding a way to be in kind of concert and really moving together with it. And you can see the strength of the personality that's going on here. I mean, this is for me one of the most extraordinary things about Jung is that he has material welling up that he himself identifies as having the intensity of psychotic-like material. But and almost anyone else in his situation would have tried to seal that up any way possible and get the hell away from it. And he doesn't do that. I mean, it's just extraordinary that he would say, I think I'll explore that. How many of you are willing to go and explore a psychotic part of your personality? That's, especially without a guide. I mean, this is just an incredible act of courage and strength on his part. And here you can see he's getting his sea legs. He really is beginning to come into his own. Now, what I told you about the other day, and I want to get to that, because the Spanish flu business is new for me. I just recently came upon that Jung had the Spanish flu in 1919, and this is rather later in the Red Book, page 131. So this is, he's digested the experience, but I wanted to tell you the dream. And it's from the Black Books. And he has a series of these dreams, as I said, about these spheres. So that must have been when I was recovering some of these dreams. The dream picture denotes the beginning of a healing process. A wonderful evening sky vaulted over the island. Then he says, between two trees, a sphere floated up or had settled there. And then he goes on to some more dreams. And this is what he's captured here. Now that sphere in the center caught my attention. I mean, it's very much like we'll see in the window of eternity, right? It has a lot of the same shape. It also, if you'll think back to Nancy Ferlatti's mandala of the coronavirus, has a lot of similarity to that image as well. And if you look, the Spanish flu was an H1N1 virus, which is very spheroidal in shape. When you do the crystallography of that, the sphere is there. I'm suggesting, and this is what I'm going to call, in many ways, the psychoid imagination, that Jung intuited the shape of what he was what he was suffering with, what was he infected with. This is a kind of noetic quality. He did this in a fever dream. Think about that. It's a really altered state of consciousness. If any of you, he had a fever at the time of 40 degrees centigrade, 104 Fahrenheit. That's a really, really high fever. And if you've ever had those, and I remember as a child having that once or twice, you get some really interesting imagery that opens up out of that state. I'm suggesting that certain kinds of minds have a way of reading that imagery noetically. That is, they can engage with it as an objective understanding of the nature of reality. I'm going to give you a couple of other examples later. I've talked about this in in Isfahan. There are some temples there or mosques there where there are these tiling patterns that just recently, about 10 years ago, they realized they were Penrose tiling. It's an extremely complex form of tiling in which it looks self-similar, but it never converges on true symmetry until infinity. So it's a symmetry that only manifests itself at full infinity. That kind of imagination, I'm suggesting, is also in this kind of construction here that Jung is involved with. And here we have a record of it, that vision. And here you've got, again, this kind of concentric circles and the layering. And this is what I keep feeling as I have been at this conference, as I listen, the way we're layering one presentation on the other, that we have this um, reconstruction in a way. It's an enactment, it's an archetypal enactment that we collectively are doing here as we ask questions and as we engage with the speakers and the material. We are creating this kind of mandala. So there's the one, the window on eternity. And what struck me on this pass through, this is done in 1927, and it's, as we've heard from several of our speakers, it's the Liverpool dream. I'm not going to go through the Liverpool dream because you've heard it 2 or 3 times, but I've gone back and thought more and more about that. And what one part of my mind would say, yeah, how come Jung didn't stop here? I mean, this is a realization of the self he had with that dream. Isn't that the goal that we usually talk about for individuation? He said this was the dream that convinced him of individuation. I actually was in China at a conference once, and I was asked to do something about dreams. So I gave them Freud's Irma dream, which is the dream of psychoanalysis, and I put it together with the Liverpool dream. And what was so extraordinary about that, the Irma dream is about Freud's patient who has almost dies, in his kind of guilt around that. He has his friend Fleiss do this crazy nasal operation on her, and he leaves the gauze packed there. And so Freud then has this dream about a dirty needle, and I'm not going to go through the amplification of that. But when I presented this to the Chinese group, there was a woman who was a Chinese doctor of both Western and Chinese medicine. And what she did is she said, oh, that tree, the closest parallel to that tree here in China is called a Mulan tree, just like the kind of character from Disney, the Mulan, the princess. Well, it's actually magnolia, or a similar species. And she said, in Chinese medicine, we use that for nasal infections. I mean, and she said, if only Freud had listened to Jung in that sense. I mean, it was an incredible cross-cultural amplification of something. And again, I'm going back after the notion of something noetic there. However, the thing is, Jung didn't stop here. He's very clear later on, and I'll show you where he stops. So I was very interested in how he started, but then also how he stopped. When did he and why? And that comes here. We've seen this a number of times. The Secret of the Golden Flower. In 1928, he receives this. And next to it is the Vajra Mandala that was accompanying the book, or the manuscript, I should say. He got the manuscript. And this, unfortunately, I can't find a color copy of this thing, an actual original. I've talked to Wilhelm's daughter, our granddaughter, about this. I've been looking for that, but I still, because Jung was so clear about the particularities of the color of the image, that it struck him as Chinese. And then he got this Secret of the Golden Flower and went, whoa, what just happened there? Well, at the same time, within a couple of months, in November of 1928, if you read the Dream Seminars, you'll have Jung talking about a ball, a dream of a patient that has this ball, this sort of solar ball, and then they come in a week later, and the patient has spontaneously drawn an image of a solar disk between the horns of a bull. And then there's about 4 or 5 people in the audience who all have bull experiences of the last week, including Jung, who receives a letter from friends in Mexico who went to a bullfight. And finally, the group stops him and says, Dr. Jung, how do you understand what's going on? What's happening here? And Jung says, well, in the West, we normally think of cause and effect. That's our explanation of reality. But in the East, they look at things falling together at the same time. They look at what we would call the kairos, and the things being synchronous. And the editors of the Dream Seminars have a footnote there that this is the very first time that the notion of synchronicity comes into Jung's vocabulary in any kind of setting. 2 years later, he makes his very first public statement when he is speaking at Wilhelm's memorial service because Wilhelm has died. And then he publicly talks about the notion of synchronicity. Doesn't publish anything then until he does the Eranos conference, where he gives that presentation. And as we heard, it was his last presentation at Eranos. The synchronicity as an endpoint here is what I'm getting to. That the kind of, because once he has this experience, Jung says, now I can stop and go back to the world of science. It takes him a couple of years to set the book down, but he actually does say this is the stopping point. This is the experience he's been looking for. Now, we can begin to play with that. My own interpretation, you don't have to accept it, but he was sitting with the dilemma of Europe filling up with blood. Am I going crazy? Then World War I breaks out. Whew, what a relief. And he does talk about feeling relieved. He's caught in that complexity of feeling relieved that war is there because he doesn't feel crazy anymore. He feels like, oh my God. But now he's on the horns of a dilemma. Am I psychotic? Am I a prophet? Neither one he wants. And I would suggest once he has this experience, he now begins to understand in a very deep way, a new way of going at this, what synchronicity holds for him. And this is part of the cosmic egg he's cooking. Now, maybe this is Abraxas and speaking through me in this one, because it's about the cosmos. On page 59, I'm going to go back a little bit and just go through this. This is a precursor. This is this is years before the patient stream and the term synchronicity is being used by Jung. He has this drawing in the Red Book. And why I have Hiranyagarbha listed there is because if you look at the bottom here, that's actually what it says there. It's like Jung, this is Jung for dummies. He said, if you didn't get it, here's what I'm really drawing here. I'm drawing the cosmic egg. He's saying this is the cosmic egg. Here's a contemporary representation of Hiranyagarbha, the cosmic egg. And by the way, Phanes, one of the other interpretations of Phanes, he calls one of his first mandalas in that sequence of mandalas around page 82 or 83, starts that. The first one he calls Phanes, the metabolism of the individual. And Phanes is, as a god in the Orphic tradition, is who is in the cosmic egg. He is wrapped with a serpent, and he's got the zodiac as the egg around him. He is the firstborn out of chaos. And so this figure of Phanes is a very powerful figure. And what I'm suggesting to you is that Jung is going after a new cosmology. Not just a personal revelation, not just my God, I've been able to make psychological sense of myself and I'm not crazy. And now I understand a new pathway for humans. He's opening up a cosmic egg. And you can see that egg. Again, it's very hard to see it in this reproduction, but go to the page 64. You'll see the figure bowing to a cracked open egg. The two white halves of the egg are there. And out comes this enormous flame. And in the Synchronicity essay, he says this: since experience has shown under certain conditions, space and time can be reduced to almost zero, causality disappears, and along with them, because causality is bound up with the existence of space and time and physical changes, and consists essentially in the succession of cause and effect. For this reason, synchronistic phenomena cannot in principle be associated with any concept of causality. This is written in the late 1940s. If you step back one step from that and say, let's look horizontally what's happening in culture, this is exactly the moment in which the notion of the Big Bang is being articulated in astrophysics. It's the exact same moment. Jung, within a year of that announcement, Jung has picked it up. And what he is arguing here, and I think contemporary astrophysicists would not have so much trouble now with this, but he's saying we've got space, time, and energy, and we're missing something. We're missing the capacity, the pattern-forming capacity that's inherent in the nature of the universe. And that pattern-forming capacity produces, at the level of human experience, synchronicity. That is part and parcel of pattern, of things falling together into patterns. And what he's saying is that's not just a part of our evolutionary history as humans. This is part of the very fundamental structure of the nature of reality. Now, he's changed the game completely in terms of what he's doing with this observation. This is his exit. He's saying, no, I understand now something fundamentally new about the nature of reality. if you ask a contemporary astrophysicist, well, what about, the the very brief time in the aftermath of the explosion of the singularity, they would talk about local asymmetries, that things are kind of folded in certain ways. So otherwise, you would have nothing. If you had a completely random system, matter and antimatter would annihilate one another, for example. So you must have had these kinds of asymmetries, and out of that, pattern is forming. So this is part of our understanding now of the nature of reality. But Jung is doing this in such a way that he brings the whole notion, and this is a question that's been raised several times here already, about, is consciousness preceding matter? This pattern forming is a part of what the nature of consciousness is. That's part of what consciousness does. It creates patterns and engages with patterns. So, I mean, I don't have an answer. I'll show you some pictures, though, in a few moments, because I'm going to shift now. I'm going to go out of the Red Book now, and I want to go to expand Jung's vision that I think was coming out of this in terms of his ecological sensibility, because I think we are still grappling with the need to develop an eco-psyche. That is, I think we've gotten caught in internal symbolism and metaphor, and we are not yet making the bridge. We're still caught in a Cartesian split. And I think Jung was looking to get beyond that. I think he's looking at a way in which the symbolism and the metaphors represent something fundamental in nature. And so I want to take you on. I started looking, are there places in Jung where that might be true? And of course, I think this has been brought up several places about the rhizome, so I won't read the quote to you, but the idea is Jung started to think about the nature of the psyche as manifesting in each of us as an individual, and yet there's something that endures underneath that connects, just like bamboo and ginger and all these other kind of plants, aspen trees that are rhizomatic, have individual shoots that come above ground, but underneath they're an interconnected network, and it's the interconnectedness that we really want to go after. That's what synchronicity is showing us. It's showing us what the deep levels of interconnection is. And I think that's why individuation wasn't enough. I think to fill out, to complete that vision, he needed synchronicity as a way of really fully connecting us to the universe, not just to one another, as important as that is, but also into the fundamental nature of reality. So now we're going to turn to one of my heroes, Suzanne Simard. She's a forest botanist up in British Columbia. She's done an extraordinary set of works. Some of you know Peter Wohllebens' The Hidden Life of Trees bestseller for a while. Well, he got much of his research, as he himself acknowledges, from Simard. And Simard has a brand new book out just last year called Finding the Mother Tree. I would highly recommend it because it's her personal biography as well as her scientific understanding. And this is a kind of feminine consciousness that we haven't quite seen before. You know, the idea that our story, our subjectivity is a part of the nature of reality, and you can watch that unfold. One of her, for time purposes, I'll keep this a little short. One of her most interesting things, she's the first to really show that trees actually take care of their seedlings. Because one of the big questions was, she's in Douglas fir forests, how do seedlings that are at the ground level, they only get 4 or 5% of the light. It's not enough for them to be able to photosynthesize sufficiently to feed themselves to get up to the canopy. And so how do they do it? And she did a whole set of experiments where she showed that parent trees were actually, through the root system, feeding their young. They're not just benevolent, they slow it down, and they're like most of us as birds. It's very hard not to be anthropomorphic here. And you can understand tree symbolism in a new way. I mean, the thing just think about this, all these cultures where the placenta is buried next to a tree, or the dead are put into the hollow of a tree. This kind of maternal aspect of the tree is part of its fundamental nature. And so that was that root system. But then she went further, and this is really some of the cutting edge stuff. She began to find that there are these fungi well, like mushroom-like creatures that intermingle their roots with the tree roots, and they get into a symbiotic relationship with them. That is, the trees will feed them sugar because they're not very good. They don't have green leaves. They don't have chlorophyll, but they're very good at breaking down rocks and extracting minerals and pulling water out of the soil. And they send that to the trees. So you got this going back and forth. That was level one. Level two was to begin to realize that they were actually hubs in a network. If you think about networks, that is these mycorrhizal, myco meaning fungi, and rhizal is this rhizomatic understory that we've got going on. That, say, for example, a beetle infestation happens at the edge of a forest. The trees that are under attack will give off phyto hormones. They'll give off chemical signals that the mycorrhizal network will transmit throughout the forest to the other species. They start to change their chemistry so that they are repulsive to the beetles. It becomes a kind of wood wide web as part of what they were talking about it. Going further, she finds that when a mother tree is beginning to die, they will download their nutrients into the net, and it will be distributed into the community to those who need it. I mean, the kind of communal consciousness that's here is adaptive. Not only does it do all of this, but these things have the capacity to really, several things. Not only do they survive like this, but they are some of the largest organisms on the planet. Let me see if I can just get. I had some numbers on this. That's why I was kind of looking for where they were. Okay, so some of the larger ones, it's been reported that there's, in North America, I can give you the reference if you want. There's one reported to occupy 2,384 acres, about 10 square kilometers. This is all one interconnected. What you have is a rhizomal network that links enormous numbers of trees into one single net, and they act and they function like a single organism with intelligence. I mean, this is adaptive intelligence. I'm talking about biointelligence. It's not cognitive in the way we think of, but when you start to look at the numbers of connections, you're getting close to numbers that look like brains. And not only is it about 10 square kilometers, but these can live a very long time. They're estimated to live between this one that I told you about, the 10 square kilometer one. They think it's somewhere between 2,400 and 8,600 years old. That it's an ongoing organism that has been from 2 to 8 millennia old. And what she's been doing with the Forest Service up there is convincing them not to cut down the mother trees. She said, look, you can harvest. I mean, she grew up in a family of loggers and so forth. And she said, it's okay to harvest, but do not kill off these mother trees, because if you plant everything else, there's no way for the rhizomal network to form. And when you don't have that, then you think you're going to get a lot of wood, but in fact, it becomes much more vulnerable to illnesses. That the kind of communication and wisdom that's in the system is not there. So let's go a little bit further. We have some time yet to look at rhizomal networks. And years ago, my first synchronicity story that I wrote about was the Black Forest. I'll very quickly give you the preview of that. This was a patient who was, again, highly, highly traumatized. And after a lot of intensive work, we agreed that I would give her a phone call while I was away on vacation. I called at the right time. She picked up the phone on the first ring and said, "Are you in Germany?" I was in the Caribbean. I just said, "No, but tell me why." And she said, "I dreamt you were in the Black Forest and I couldn't find you." So we spent the hour on the phone kind of helping regain reality. And magically, this was the last time she had to be hospitalized for the rest of the time I knew her. I mean, it really was something. We can go into that if you want the clinical material. But what happened the next day, I was diving. And the dive master, my very first dive in open water, we get about 45 minutes out from the dock, and he says, "Let me tell you about today's dive site. It's called the Black Forest." It's like, oh, really? Black coral is what it was. And it was a transformative experience. I going about 60 feet underwater into this other world realm. It was like going into the unconscious in many ways. Colors, images, creatures that I had not seen before. I just was absolutely transformed. And I got back up on the boat and thought, I got to understand what just happened. And there's a lot more I can say to unpack that, but this whole thing about forest is here I am 30 some years later, and I'm still in the forest. That black forest, that understory is very much a part of my psychic life. While we were in the Caribbean, I got interested in some of the indigenous art that was going on, especially from Haiti, the Voodoo art, and Lavoie Excel, who's had some exhibitions at the Smithsonian and Washington, D.C. I bought some of his art. I knew nothing about rhizomes at the time. I wasn't thinking about this was 30 years ago. And here's the first one of the two I'll show you of his paintings I have, because I want you to have a feeling for how this is in the deep collective, this rhizomatic consciousness. So you've got these Loa, spirits of the night. Selden Rodman, if for anybody's really interested, was the person, the art historian who did the work around Exil and a whole group they're called Sans Soleil. And what you can see here is this rhizomatic structure that links these three Loa-like figures. Look at their eyes. They're those cat-like eyes for seeing in the dark. These are creatures of the night. And there's a consciousness in that underworld, nighttime world that's in the vegetative world. And he goes on, and I bought this at the same time, this one here, this catching the sun in the underworld between these vegetative structures. I mean, think back for a moment to that philosophical tree with the sphere in it. This is the same image in many, many ways. It's this nighttime vision, even the same kind of blue, where there's a consciousness there that's what I would call the lumen naturae. This is, I would argue strongly that it's not the only way to interpret the lumen naturae, but biological intelligence is beginning to be recognized as being much greater than any of us had imagined. We've been far too dismissive of creatures, in quote, less than us. We've put ourselves on the top of a pyramid and have been blinded to the intelligence that's there. I can show you pictures of slime molds doing very sophisticated calculations. I've got one, I don't have a picture here, where a group of engineers in Tokyo laid out a map and they put oat bran flakes where the main stations were in Tokyo, and they put some slime mold in overnight, let it grow overnight. The trails that it got was a very good representation of what it took them about 15 years to organize and develop. And their point was, if we learn how to dialogue with nature, it can tell us very much. It really can solve many of our problems, that we need to learn to partner with nature. I think it's a real shift in consciousness about our relationship to the planet and to the earth. And COVID is a part of that. Look, there's very good evidence. The Chan Center at Harvard is doing a lot of climate change work, and they have tracked that the outbreak, that the opportunistic hopping from species to species with COVID was due to global warming. That what happened is that many of the animals that were living in the tropics, it got too hot with global warming. They began to move up to higher latitudes, and they got into contact with migrating birds and bats. You got species transmission that then gets taken to the wet markets, and boom, you've now got a major problem on your hand. That's human driven. Well, we don't see it, but in fact, and what scares me, if we don't pay attention to this, is this is not the last. This is the first. I mean, it isn't going to be another 100 years. If we keep doing this, we are going to upset the things in nature. And nature doesn't have a vengeance against us as the species, I don't think. At least I don't imagine it quite that way. But I do think it will react to the kind of changes that we're creating on the planet, and these kinds of things will happen more and more, and that's on us. I mean, I think there's a level of consciousness now that we need to develop with our relationship to the planet and the world and to these biological intelligences. How do we contact them? Is active imagination a possibility? I think, again, when I talked about the psychoid imagination, I think there's something there that we can actually use to be in deeper contact. Read Simard's book about finding the mother tree. She doesn't claim that she's in direct conscious communication, but yet there's a kind of knowing. And these are these altered states of consciousness that are more diffuse than our nice ego consciousness. But as we begin to explore the range of altered states of consciousness, like Jung's fever dream, I think we can find noetic potentials in those. I mean, after all, even if you go back to Freud, free association, that's a lowering of the level of consciousness. You deliberately delocalize your consciousness. You deliberately make it a little more porous to unconscious material. And what do you pick up? Fields, interactive fields. That's what Freud was doing. That's the whole, listening with the telephone. I mean, it's a kind of, we can expand that metaphor in terms of the interactive field that we can begin to really more deeply pick up. I love, on the psychoanalytic side, the study of reveries, because these are what seem like ordinary, mundane things that at first you're embarrassed. Oh my God, I let my mind drift. So a quick synchronicity story. I had a patient who, well put together man. We'd been working for a couple of years. We came to one of those moments of silence that you sometimes get in analysis. It was a moment of repose. And as we both sat there, suddenly I remembered a dream image from the morning. And I thought, wow, where did that come from? I mean, I normally never remember during an hour, and I usually it's right at the beginning. And so I looked over at him and I saw he was a bit glazed over. That he was in a slightly dissociated state. And I very gently tried to say something. I said, hey, what's going on or something? And I could see I startled him and embarrassed him, and, oh, nothing. And I said, well, truth is, I found myself my mind was sort of wandering. And I looked and it looked like maybe you were, in a wandering state as well. And so he settled back down and reconnected. And he said, well, I was out the window. And I said, out the window? He said, yeah. He said, I was going back to the day, he was an adopted kid. I was going back to the day that my parents adopted my younger brother. I thought, okay, I've heard this story before. And then he told me something he'd never told me. Said, well, that day I went over to the neighbors and they had a swimming pool. They weren't home. They had a swimming pool and it was empty. And I fell in. And I banged my head and I went unconscious for about 5 minutes. And he said, I went home and I never told anyone. He was very ashamed about this, because he'd made an error. He'd fallen into an unconscious suicidal attempt. I mean, he understood that, and so did I. My dream that I'd recalled was I'd been working on the Splendor Solus. And I remembered I had dreamt of the second flask in the fourth treatise. What that is, it's an alembic which has a red bird, a black bird, and a white bird, and they're all laying at the bottom of the flask. And it says, Solomon Trismuson's commentary says, they have either knocked themselves out, they've been fighting and they've knocked themselves out, or they're dead. And so you see what was in the field, the Black Forest, the image of knocking oneself out. These are field phenomena. I saw them through my trip to the underwater realm, to the dream image. The patient saw it through their narrative. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the patient's. It was in the interactive field between us. And we can go to Jung. This was for Lumen Naturae. I'm sorry, I left out Andy Goldworthy's. There was one more of the Lumen Naturae. The beautiful thing about sycamore leaves that he placed around the tree to just give that luminous feeling to what's in nature there. If we have the eyes to see it, if we really can open our minds to the intelligences there. I'm going to skip over that. And this was what I was going to say, the one Linda used. The interactive field. What I would suggest is the center, the A EFB is the interactive field. You've got the intrapsychic component, and then you've got the dyadic interactive field. And I would say the whole thing is surrounded by we are embedded in our environments. It's a more complex field than this is drawing, but you get the feeling that this is what you can use your reveries to explore. You can, if you tune into this, this is where this kind of field becomes activated. I would suggest Jung used amplification to spot this. I'm more and more convinced that when Jung amplified, it wasn't for just a mythic parallel. He was trying to catch what is coming in the room at this very moment. What is the psyche manifesting? What's the pattern? And how do I know it? And amplification is a pretty good tool. I would think of it like staining a cell. If you wanted to look at the different parts of a cell, you throw a stain on it, and then you put it under the microscope and they pop out. You can see the mitochondria or this, the nucleus or whatever in the cell. You can't do that if you don't put a stain on it. And amplification is not a bad stain. So now to go back, very fun. This is the universe at its very largest scale. What you are looking at, the filaments are hundreds of thousands of galaxies. That's the size we're looking at. Galaxies, not stars. Each one of them holding billions to trillions of stars. And the dark spaces in between are what's being created by dark energy pushing things apart. It's giving it this rhizomatic feel. The strands are held together by dark matter. This is one of the hottest areas in science, the dark energy, dark matter. Every week you get publications on this. Nobody knows what this is. It's like where the psyche is. I'm always interested to see where the unknown is in other areas and how that's relevant to where scientific exploration goes. Well, within 3 days of that image being published, somebody came up with this one. They took a slice through a mouse brain and compared the neuronal structure to the cosmic web structure. And if you don't know the scale, you don't know what's what. You don't know what you're looking at. Does that mean the cosmos is intelligent, that it has a brain? I can't say that. I mean, it's tempting, it's very tempting to kind of make those kind of moves. But if I do that, then I've projected myself onto the material. And maybe that's right. And if it is right, then is there a way to be talking to the cosmos? I mean, how do we begin that? And so that brings me to my last little section. I think I've got about 2 or 3 minutes. And that is, let's go to Delphi. For a wrap, I'm interested in these fields that I just was describing, and I'm interested in the figures who have been traditionally the oracular figures. Delphi, of course, for almost 2,000 years, the priestess of Delphi held sway and really gave these oracles that were incredibly interesting and complex. What's happened in the last 15 years, classicists have begun to go back and re-examine that whole tradition. And one of the things that they pointed out is here you've got, fundamentally, when you look at all the oracular sites, you have a bunch of middle-aged women of no particular political power now ruling the Mediterranean because they are the advice givers to kings and counselors, that people come from everywhere and that they stabilize the region for 2,000 years. I mean, it's really incredible. This is not my research. This is Stephen Moll in Germany. Another one is Peter Struck in the United States. Actually, what got me going, he had a book called Divination and Human Nature. And he talks about divination as the surplus of meaning, that they spoke out of a surplus of meaning, very much like dream material, right? I mean, it's that kind of, and what happened at the turn of the century, and this is what I think is so fascinating. At the end of the 19th century, as Freud and Jung are doing their thing and developing depth psychology, archaeologists and geologists went to Delphi, and they were trying to see whether Plutarch had described this accurately, because Plutarch, the historian, was also a priest of Delphi. And what Plutarch did is he talked about the sweet smell and the gas that came up out of the earth and so forth, Neuma, not gas, he would have said Neuma, and that this was what inspired the priestess. And they looked and they said, no, there's nothing there. There's no faults or anything. This must be all just a fantasy construction in that negative, hostile way. Well, in 2001, another group of archaeologists and geoscientists with much better modern equipment went there. And sure enough, what had happened over the centuries since then, there had been some tectonic shifts, but they were able to follow the motion back. The Abaton, where she sat underneath, was directly under where the faults crossed. And in fact, they have evidence that ethylene gas was coming up out of that. Ethylene gas is a very simple hydrocarbon. It has a sweet smell, and it can, even in low doses, create hallucinatory experiences. So there's fundamental biochemical information there that there was something going on I use this as a kind of altered state of consciousness that has a noetic dimension to it. That's part of what we need to start to map out. Where will all of this lead? I mentioned this just briefly, and this is the last slide, is to the whole question of re-enchantment. It's so interesting. Ludwig Klages, who we heard about from our dear friend Paul Bishop. I first read about him in this book here in 2017, Jason Josephson's Storm, in the Myth of Disenchantment. What he's going back is he's looking at Max Weber's idea of disenchantment, and first off showing that Weber was himself very interested in occult phenomena and was involved in all kinds of movements. That he was trying to talk about what had happened with science and its kind of enlightenment disenchanting of the world. Well, himself actually, and most of these people were living lives that were full of enchantment. And with that, he says, out of all of this exploration, what Josephson's Storm says is that really what we're looking at is a myth of disenchantment. That was the cultural myth for these people. And remember, Weber dies in 1920 because of the Spanish flu. He was 56 years old, and he died of the Spanish flu. And this whole myth of disenchantment that we've been living in throughout the last century, I think is now ripe for a reconsideration, for a re-enchantment. And I think Jung's synchronicity is a part of the story. That's exactly where I'm trying to go with this, that by the cosmological move that Jung makes, by the allowing psyche to be not only non-local, but distributed in nature, that the symbolism is not just in us. It's not enskulled, as you said, Linda. It is part of our emergent interaction with the world. That's a re-enchantment of the world. And I think then we may want to go back to these other forms of indigenous knowledge that didn't maybe have our sharp, discrete ego consciousness, but had the capacity to be in touch with this whole other realm of our world and re-embrace that. What would that do to us? How might that help us think about the COVID situation, about the Ukrainian situation? And so here it is. May we be on the threshold of a fourth epoch of return to enchantment. So thank you very much for your attention.